Humans scare me. They truly do. It's terrifying to know what others are capable of. Imagine what you could do. Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. I'm your host Emily, and today we're counting down our list of the top 10 disturbing evil experiments in modern history. Number 10. Project 4.1. Project 4.1 was a medical study conducted on the natives of Marshall Islands who in 1952 were exposed to radiation from the Castle Bravo nuclear test at Bikini Atoll, which inadvertently blew upwind to the nearby islands. Now, instead of informing the residents of the island of their exposure and treating the victims while they studied them, which would make the most sense and be the right thing to do, the good old US elected instead just to watch quietly and see what happened. And let me just say, this is extremely messed up. At first, the effects were inconclusive. For the first 10 years, miscarriages and stillbirths increased but then returned to normal. Some people had developmental problems or stunted growth, but no conclusive pattern was detectable. After that first decade though, a pattern did emerge and it was ugly. There was an increase of thyroid cancer in young people, significantly above what would be considered normal. By 1974, almost a third of exposed islanders developed tumors. A report stated that the dual purpose of what is now a Department of Energy medical program has led to a view by the Marshallese that they were being used as guinea pigs in a radiation experiment, which is just messed up. Number 9. Separating triplets. In the 1960s and 1970s, clinical psychologists led by Peter Newberer ran a secret experiment in which they separated twins and triplets from each other and adopted them out as singlets. The experiment, said to have been partly funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, came to life when three identical triplet brothers accidentally found each other in 1980. They had no idea they had siblings. David Kelman, one of the triplets, felt anger towards the experiment. "We were robbed of 20 years together," he said. His brother Edward Galland died by ending his own life in 1995 at his home in Maplewood, New Jersey, according to the LA Times. The psychiatrists who were in charge, Peter and Viola Bernard, showed no remorse for their experiment, according to news reports. Viola went as far as to say they thought they were doing something good for them, separating them so they could develop their individual personalities. As for what Peter learned from his secret evil experiment, that's anyone's guess, as the results of the controversial study are being stored in an archive at Yale University and they can't be unsealed until 2066. So hey, only 43 years until we find out the truth. Number 8. The Stanford Prison Experiment. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo, a professor at Stanford University, set out to test the nature of human nature, to answer questions such as what happens when you put good people in evil situations. To achieve this, he set up a prison and paid college students to play guards and prisoners, who inevitably seemed to transform into barbaric guards and hysterical prisoners. The 2-week experiment was shut down after just 6 days because things turned chaotic fast. In only a few days, our guards became sadistic and our prisoners became depressed and showed signs of extreme stress, Zimbardo stated. Those subjects assigned to guards enforced authoritarian measures and subjected the prisoners to psychological torture. Surprisingly, many of the prisoners accepted the treatment. The guards, pretty much from the get-go, treated the prisoners awfully, humiliating them by stripping them naked and spraying their bodies with chemicals and generally harassing and intimidating them. It's insane to me that they let this go on for 6 days. Number 7. Infected mosquitoes in towns. In 1956 and 1957, the United States Army conducted a number of biological warfare experiments on cities of Savannah, Georgia and Avon Park, Florida. It's crazy to me that they would experiment on their own people, especially without telling them, but I mean, it is America. In one experiment, millions of infected mosquitoes were released into the two cities in order to see if the insects could spread yellow fever and dengue fever. Not surprisingly, hundreds of researchers contracted illnesses that included fevers, respiratory problems, stillbirths, encephalitis, and typhoid. Now, in order to photograph the results of their experiments, Army researchers pretended to be public health workers, and several people died as a result of the research. Sounds like they just did this to themselves, but why would you do that to poor innocent people? Number 6. Mustard gas tested on American military. Mustard gas is a type of chemical warfare agent. As a chemical weapon, mustard gas was first used in World War I. In 1943, the US Navy exposed its own sailors to mustard gas. Officially, the Navy was testing the effectiveness of new clothing and gas masks against the deadly gas that had been proven so terrifying in the First World War. But the worst of the experiment occurred at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington. Young men were approached after 8 weeks of boot camp and asked if they wanted to participate in an experiment that would help shorten the war. Obviously, they said yes, but they didn't know what they were signing up for. Only when the boys reached the research laboratory were they told the experiment involved mustard gas. In 2015, Roland Edwards, a soldier, spoke out about going through the experiment. He said, "It felt like you were on fire, guys started screaming and hollering and trying to break out, and then some of the guys fainted, and finally they opened the door and let us out, and the guys they were in bad shape." The participants, almost all of whom suffered severe external and internal burns, were ignored by the Navy, and in some cases threatened with the Espionage Act. In 1991, the reports were finally declassified and taken before Congress. Now listen, I'm not shocked that they were ignored afterwards, but that is just horrible. Number 5. Radioactive materials in pregnant women. So shortly after World War II, with the impending Cold War on the minds of Americans, many medical researchers were preoccupied with the idea of radioactivity and chemical warfare. This is a valid concern, so they did an experiment at Vanderbilt University. 829 pregnant women were given vitamin drinks they were told would help improve the health of their unborn babies. Instead, the drinks contained radioactive iron, and the researchers were studying how quickly the radioisotope crossed into the placenta. This is just messed up. I can't imagine thinking you're taking something that will help your own health and your future baby, but instead it does the opposite thing. Some of the women gave birth, and at least 7 of those born later died from cancers and leukemia. In addition, the women themselves experienced rashes, bruises, anemia, loss of hair and teeth, and cancer. Now this is just plain evil to me and makes me so upset. Number 4. Human experimentation in North Korea. Now, North Korea is known for being a horrible place. The North Korean government does not permit freedom of thought, opinion, expression, or information. All media is strictly controlled. Accessing phones, computers, televisions, radios, or media content that is not sanctioned by the government is illegal and considered anti-socialist behavior to be severely punished. North Koreans who have fled from the country in spite of legal punishment have described witnessing disturbing cases of human experimentation. In one alleged experiment, 50 healthy women prisoners were given poisoned cabbage leaves, and all 50 women were dead within 20 minutes. Other described experiments that include the practice of surgery on prisoners without anesthesia, purposeful starvation, beating prisoners over the head before using the zombie-like victims for target practice, and chambers in which whole families are put to death with suffocation gas. It is said that each month, a black van known as the Crow collects 40 to 50 people from a camp and takes them to a known location for experiments. I can't imagine the anxiety of thinking, am I next? Number 3. German medical experiments. During World War II, Germans performed medical experiments on prisoners in death camps. These prisoners were subject to heinous crimes under the guise of military advancement, medical and pharmaceutical advancement, and racial and population advancement. They were subjected to experiments intended to benefit the military, including hypothermia studies where prisoners were immersed in ice water in an effort to ascertain how long a drowned pilot could survive in similar conditions. Some victims were only allowed seawater, a study of how long pilots could survive at sea, and these subjects, not surprisingly, died of dehydration. Victims were also exposed to high altitude and decompression chambers, often followed with brain dissection on the living, to study high altitude sickness and how pilots would be affected by atmospheric pressure changes. Treating war injuries and pharmaceutical testing also went on in these camps. Victims were inflicted with wounds that were intentionally infected. Infections and poisonings were also studied on human subjects. Tuberculosis was injected into prisoners in an effort to better understand how to immunize against the infection. Experiments with poison to determine how fast subjects would die were also on the agenda. The Germans also performed genetic and racially motivated sterilizations, artificial inseminations, and also conducted experiments on twins and people of short stature. Absolutely disgusting. Number 2. The Aversion Project. Gay people were not liked in South Africa, especially in the armed forces. So they decided to get rid of them, and it's shocking. Using army psychiatrists and military chaplains who were presumably privy to private, confidential confessions, the regime flushed out homosexuals in the armed forces. But it did not evict them from the military. The homosexual undesirables were sent to a military hospital near Pretoria, a place called Ward 22, which in itself sounds terrifying. There, between 1971 and 1989, Dr. Aubrey Levin took care of patients. Many victims were subjected to chemical castrations and electric shock treatment meant to cure them of their homosexual condition. Dr. Levin used electroconvulsive aversion therapy to reordinate his patients. Electrodes were strapped to a patient's upper arm with wires running to a dial calibrated from 1 to 10. Homosexual men were also shown pictures of naked men and encouraged to fantasize, at which point the patient was subjected to severe shocks. When Dr. Levin was warned that he would be known as taking advantage of human rights, he immigrated to Canada. All I gotta say is, someone get him out of our country. Also, gay people and anyone in the LGBT community are not sick, we do not need to be cured, we are human, and you cannot get rid of us. And coming in at number 1 is Unit 731. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit in the Imperial Japanese Army that undertook lethal human experimentation during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. It was responsible for some of the most notorious war crimes carried out by the Japanese personnel. Some of the numerous atrocities committed by the commander Shiro Ishii and others under his command in Unit 731 include vivisection of living people, including pregnant women who were impregnated by the doctors. Prisoners had limbs amputated and reattached to other parts of their body. Some prisoners had parts of their body frozen and thawed to study the resulting untreated gangrene. Humans were also used as living test cases for grenades and flamethrowers. Prisoners were injected with strains of diseases disguised as vaccinations to study their effects. Now, having been granted immunity by the American occupation authorities at the end of the war, Ishii never spent any time in jail for his crimes and died at the age of 67 of throat cancer. Now, the death toll of these brutal experiments is unknown, but as many as 200,000 may have died, estimates historian Sheldon H. Harris, according to a 1995 New York Times report. Now, this is just horrible, 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 and an abuse of power. How anyone could do this to other people truly disgusts me. Well, that's all for our list of the top 10 disturbing evil experiments in modern history. I feel sick after hearing all of these. Some humans are truly awful. Which experiment do you think was the worst? Let us know in the comments down below, and we'll see you next time.